With the announcement of the Moana live-action remake, on top of the fact that the Moana Disney Plus show hadn't even been so much as mentioned in years, it looked for a while that any plans for a continuation of the original movie were going to end up dead in the water. So with the surprise announcement that Moana was indeed getting a theatrically released sequel, which many would argue is what the first movie deserved, it was met with both delight and reservation from many, seeing as how the movie was a retooled version of the aforementioned Disney Plus show, which brought back many unpleasant memories of Disney's direct-to-video sequels. But now that Moana 2 has finally been released, the question must be asked, was it a worthy follow-up to the original and worth waiting 8 years for? Or was it yet another Disney sequel that only succeeded in disappointing everybody? And today, I'd like to give my personal opinion on how I felt about Moana 2 and what its success could mean for the future of Disney. And there will be major spoilers ahead, so in case you haven't had the chance to see it yet and don't want to know what happens, you should click off this video and come back after you have seen it. I won't be giving out any other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so to give the short answer first, Moana 2 isn't great, but it's not bad either. Contrary to what some would have you believe, I wouldn't say this movie is embarrassing, a disaster, or a waste of time. But then again, maybe I'm just easy to please, so if you genuinely think it's any of those things, that's most definitely you're right. But either way, I'd say it's pretty good all things considered. And to go over the good stuff first, the cast is in top form and haven't missed a beat since the original, with both leads in particular once again killing it in their roles and losing none of their chemistry. And to go along with that, it does have a fairly interesting story. I know many have drawn comparisons between it and Frozen 2, but the thing is, a road trip style plot to lift a curse does fit a Moana sequel a lot better, especially considering the main setting is a tiny island. So it's almost a given that a major part of the story is going to be about them having to travel the ocean to get somewhere. And speaking of that, the movie also introduces some good concepts and builds on what's established in the first movie in interesting ways, as well as has some pretty funny moments. Though the part where Maui tries to convince a particular fish to get his hook just because it didn't blink had to be one of the funniest moments for me. And the new characters were also handled pretty well too. Now I know there have been some complaints about them being very one-dimensional in nature and not contributing much to the story, but as I got into in my video on new characters, which you can find a link in the description to, putting new characters into a sequel and having them hijack the whole story is one of the biggest indicators of declining quality. So it was a smart move on the writer's part to not put too much emphasis on them and at least try to keep the focus on Moana and Maui. Though sure, maybe they could have done more with them, but at least they didn't go in the opposite direction and have the new characters steal the spotlight. But I do have to say, one character that they messed up was the Bat Lady, Matagni. Because when she first appears, she's built up as a menacing yet charismatic threat that can give Maui, a demigod, a run for his money, and moreover seems to express a desire to hurt Moana because of what Maui taught her. And this is only backed up in her subsequent appearance when Moana herself encounters her and she starts messing with her the same way she did with Maui. But then, After probably the best song in the entire movie, it turns out that she's trying to help them against her master's orders and lets them all leave after teaching Moana a lesson. And it's like, Disney, you just don't get it, do you? I've said it a million times before, and I'll say it again. They are letting Pixar influence them way too much. Maybe it's just the writer in me, as I've written quite a few books, but Matagni had the setup to be a perfect villain. Exactly the kind of Disney villain that audiences have been craving for so long. The kind King Magnifico couldn't quite be. And they had to once again pull the rug out from under us. What is it with Disney's obsession with redemption here? I know I can only speak for myself when I say this, but Disney, we want real, genuinely evil villains back. Save the redemption and tragic stories for the heroes, or at the most the villain's sidekick. Because Matagni has cool powers, is extremely charismatic, and is effortlessly able to establish herself as a threat. What more could one possibly ask for in a Disney villain? If they had just committed to making her the bad guy, instead of some god you don't even see until the credits, then she would probably already be in league with the best of them. That's how good her initial setup is. But maybe we'll finally get an actual villain in Moana 3 if that does get made, so there's always that, I guess. But either way, if it had been me writing this movie, I would have had it so that her musical number is used to screw with Moana and throw her and the audience on the wrong track. And from there, she would continue to manipulate her so that she might start to mistrust Maui, since she seems to have all the answers. And the setup for a conflict like that is even present right there in the movie. They just don't follow through on it. Now, the climax is actually pretty good on its own, I will admit. But having Moana come to mistrust Maui in favor of the villain manipulating her and not knowing who to listen to because of that could have added a lot more stakes and tension to that climax than there already is, as well as given a more personal struggle that some felt Moana was lacking. As I dedicated a whole other video to, which you can also find a link in the description to. Villains exist in stories for a reason, and more often than not do end up enhancing the story rather than take away from it. And even afterwards, when she inevitably does choose to trust Maui, she could have then served as another obstacle for them to overcome in raising the island. As I just said, there was so much potential with this character, but Disney just couldn't help but make the same mistake again. But going back to something I touched on before, the songs couldn't quite live up to the ones in the first movie, but they weren't bad either. I mean, it could have been better, but it could have been way worse. So overall, I'd say they did a pretty decent job as far as that goes. But seriously, if Disney clearly wants to use Lin-Manuel Miranda again, why don't they just get him instead of using substitutes? And as far as other little complaints go, the movie had a little too much meta humor. I mean, I know the first one already leaned pretty heavily into that, but here it felt a little excessive at times. And I also don't really understand the addition of Moana's little sister, considering her inclusion doesn't really add anything to the story. You could take her out and it would all be more or less the same. But it's not like she detracts from it either, as she does at least add to Moana's character. I just really don't understand where the idea to include her came from a writing standpoint. And I also don't get why they redesigned Moana. I mean, they obviously wanted to make her look older, but they didn't have to change her appearance that much, especially since I personally think her design in the original film was already perfect. So why mess with it? And for one other thing, the climax was a bit intense, especially when one takes into account that this is supposed to theoretically be a children's movie. Though to be fair, I would say that the rest of the movie actually did a pretty good job of being suitable for kids and not being too mature for them, and more so than most of Disney's more recent output at that. But like I just said, the climax in particular might have taken it a bit too far. And it was also pretty confusing, considering it never even explains what exactly happened. Though it's easy enough to infer it, but Maui giving a quick explanation of what it all means would have been nice. So as I said before, this isn't a great sequel, but not a bad one either. Just for a comparison, it's miles better than something like Ralph Breaks the Internet. Since, if nothing else, it didn't totally assassinate either of the characters and left things in a good enough place that a third movie could build off of it without having to embrace its weaker elements. In other words, this movie is nowhere near as bad as most of the direct-to-video sequels were. It's not Toy Story 2 either, but again, at least it didn't destroy the potential for a third movie to be good because it made so many bad decisions. But speaking of that, a lot of the talent behind the first movie that didn't return was definitely felt. And it probably would have been better if Disney had given the movie a little more time to smooth out the story and even see if they could bring some of that talent back instead of rushing out what they had. But considering how rushed it was, it's almost impressive that it turned out as well as it did. But there's also the precedence this movie might set to consider as well. Now, I already touched on this topic in my Inside Out 2 video, which you can also find a link in the description to as far as Pixar goes. But with Moana 2, it's a completely different ballgame altogether. Because Disney has never been known to release sequels to one of their movies under the official Walt Disney Animation banner, and have only done it a handful of times throughout their history. And usually not to great results at that. But considering how IP obsessed Hollywood has become, if this movie does really well in spite of the fact that it could have been better, it might end up telling Disney that their future lies in making sequels as opposed to what they've always done, which is make new adaptations of classic stories, be they fairy tales or otherwise. And if all they end up doing is making sequel after sequel from here on out, where will they be in the next 10 to 15 years? Walt Disney built his company on always trying new things and being innovative. And if they abandon that in favor of easy money, will that just erase whatever's left of the Disney magic? Though at the same time, what do I know? I'm no expert in these matters. Considering how the box office looked in 2024 overall, maybe general audiences really do want sequels to classic movies up the wazoo and aren't interested in more original ideas anymore. Maybe sequels, spin-offs, and franchises really are the way of the future, and original stories just aren't in anymore. But if that truly is the case, then we're just as guilty as the studios who want cash cow franchises. Theoretically, Hollywood is supposed to be a place where artists get to bring their visions of new and impossible stories to life. Movies are one of the best forms of entertainment because the possibilities are frankly endless. But if nobody, audiences or studios, wants that anymore, then that is on us. Certain creators are still trying to make original movies, but people just don't seem interested anymore. And I'm just afraid that, whatever the reason for that is, one of the casualties of it could end up being Disney animation itself. Throughout its quote 100-year history, its filmography has consisted almost entirely of independent stories, and if they end up abandoning that in favor of countless sequels, I do fear it'll end up doing more harm than good in the long run. Because I am a huge fan of Disney. Always have, always will be. And if you hate me because of that, go ahead. But I do actually want to see the company succeed and care about what's best for it. So I am genuinely worried that too many sequels on their part could lead to potential consequences. And I personally believe that Disney sequels are best when they're released separately from those in the Disney animated canon, like as a direct-to-video feature or straight to Disney Plus, as people will view it through a different lens that way. But only time will tell on all of this, I suppose. So the point is, Moana 2 isn't as good as the original movie, but is also far from the worst sequel Disney ever made, even if that's not a very high bar to clear. It may not leave the audience with the best experience of their life, but it won't leave them tearing out their hair either. And it's sad to say, but considering Disney's track record, that's about all one can really ask for from a Disney sequel anyway. But as I noted before, there's also where Disney is going to end up as a result of it and what message is really being sent to them. Because there is potential for the company to end up in a very bad place if they take the wrong lessons away from it. But for the moment anyway, there really isn't much more to say than that. Overall, it's a movie worth seeing, but it won't change your life or anything like that. Alright, I think that's everything I've got on that. So now I'd like to hear from all of you. What did you think of Moana 2? And does it line up with what I had to say on it, or not? And do you think its success will have a negative impact on Disney going forward? Whatever the case is, please feel free to let me know in the comments. And as I said many times throughout the video, you don't have to agree with a single thing I said. You can feel absolutely any way you want to about Moana 2 and are entitled to have that opinion. And I don't think any less of you if you have a different opinion than me. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.